you for joining us today for the 2021 Laboratory Sampler Training video for the ODA Hemp Program. My name is Emily Roque. I'm the Hemp Testing Specialist at the ODA. Also on this video is Sunny Summer. She's our Cannabis Policy Coordinator. She is going to be joining us at the end of this presentation for questions. And so she's also available here as well. So I just think with that, let's get started. I wanted to say this video is going to be put on our YouTube, so anybody who's not able to attend today will have that to go look at before they go out in the field and do sampling. So, and Sunny's also in control of my slides. So when I say next, we're going to switch to the next slide. So I think we're ready for that next slide, Sunny. Perfect. And please bear with me, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties today, so it might be a little bit slower, but we're trying to work with what we've got. So I wanted to start off by giving an agenda of the topics we'll be covering today. First, I'll start off by giving an overview of hemp and its uses. Then I'll explain a little bit about the regulation timeline of hemp in Oregon. After that, I'll give you an overview and an update of the hemp program. I'll then describe the requirements that registered growers have when it comes to testing. I'll explain how growers actually request pre-harvest testing. Then I'll go over the sampling protocols for pre-harvest hemp testing, which is, I'm sure, the main thing that we want to talk about. Lastly, I'll describe the ways that you can report your results to our program. And like I said, I think we'll definitely have some time at the end for questions. So feel free to ask them at the end. Okay, next slide. So for those of you who may not know, hemp is defined as cannabis with a total THC concentration at or below 0.3%. Hemp and marijuana are different varieties of the same plant. However, hemp usually has higher concentrations of CBD and lower concentrations of THC, which is the main psychoactive component of cannabis. Hemp can be used in a variety of ways as shown on this image. It's used in cosmetics, foods, supplements, tinctures, salves. Hemp is getting used in so many things these days, and it's really boosted in its popularity. So that's exciting. Next slide, please. I wanted to give a brief overview of hemp regulation in Oregon. So the 2014 Farm Bill gave states the opportunity to regulate hemp under a pilot program, and then ODA started issuing hemp registrations in 2015. Then in the 2018 Farm Bill, it had language in it that said that testing must include post-decarboxylation or a similar method. And then ODA put rules into place May of 2019 that required all pre-harvest tests measure total THC as of January 1st of last year. So we switched in years prior, pre-harvest testing used to only measure Delta 9 THC. And then as of January 1st of last year, all pre-harvest tests are for total THC. So that requirement is still the same for all pre-harvest tests this year. It's measuring total THC. I did want to note that although this presentation is going to cover pre-harvest testing, post-harvest testing has been for total THC as well, and that's actually been a requirement since 2018. So now both pre-harvest and post-harvest testing measures total THC. Next slide, please. The ODA hemp program registers hemp growers, handlers, and seed producers. The program also ensures that registrants have their hemp or hemp items tested as required. So growers are required to have their hemp tested prior to harvest, and that's what we refer to as a pre-harvest test. And handlers are required to have the items that they process tested as well, and that's what we refer to as a post-harvest test. The hemp program regulates hemp in Oregon using Oregon Administrative Rules 603-048, and these rules are on our website. So I'm asking everyone to please familiarize yourselves with these rules. There's also the sampling and testing protocols that are in those rules as well. So be sure to check those out. They're available on our website, and let me know if you have any questions about that, myself or Sunny. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, next I wanted to go over some of the hemp production numbers in Oregon for last year, 2020. As you can see on this graph, there was a slight decrease in the number of grower registrations that we issued. So the blue bar is what you're looking at. The 2019, it looked like we had about 1,960 grower registrations. Then in 2020, we had about 1,811 grower registrations, so a slight decrease. This map of Oregon shows the 2020 registered production areas. So you can see the clusters in Southern Oregon, up towards Portland along the I-5 corridor, and then in Bend as well. So those are the hot spots of growing hemp, I guess you could say. And then if you can click on that slide, Sunny, there should be another graph that pops up. Okay, so this is the graph. I just wanted to show a pretty significant decrease in the acreage that we saw between 2019 and 2020. So in 2019, we had about 64,000 registered acres, and then in 2020, we had about 28,000. So a pretty steep decline there. Next slide, please. Okay, so last year we also started doing inspections of hemp grow sites. So the inspections were both random and complaint driven. One of the goals we had with the inspections was to work with the growers to ensure that all of the requirements, the compliance requirements of growing hemp in Oregon were being met. We plan to continue doing inspections in 2021 as well. So I've included a map of the territories of our hemp inspectors for your reference. Please feel free to contact an inspector if you have any questions or concerns about a particular grow site in that region. I've also provided you the 2020 testing data that we have so far. It's not a typo. So far, we have 2021 pre-harvest tests for 2020 that have been submitted. Of that 2021, approximately 141 of them were failing results. And failing is anything above 0.34%. If you don't know, we do allow for rounding. So anything 0.34 or below gets rounded down to 0.3, and then anything 0.35 or above is considered failing. I wanted to also note that this 141 number does include retesting and resampling fails as well. I think we can move on to the next slide. So as mentioned earlier, hemp growers are required to have all areas registered to them, sampled and tested by a laboratory accredited by the Oregon Health Authority and licensed by the Oregon Liquor Control Commission before harvesting. Growers must also begin harvesting the harvest lot that was sampled within 28 days from the date that the sampler was out taking their sample. Growers are also required to ensure that their testing and sampling documents have been submitted to our program. And growers are also required to complete and send in a sample request form to the lab of their choosing before the sampler gets on site. So those are the requirements, some of the requirements that growers have. We can move on to the next slide. I wanted to go over the sample request forms. So these are the forms that you should get from the growers prior to sampling. Some key things to remember regarding this form. One is that a grow site can have multiple production areas. So I like to think of a grow site as like an overall farm. And then on that farm, let's say you had 3 fields and 2 greenhouses. Those would be considered the production areas. Um, and then if you want to break it down even further, if you had a field that you, let's say, were growing 3 strains in and you wanted to test each strain differently, you could do that by breaking it down into additional harvest lots, and that's where we have that harvest lot name section. You would just take that field name, put it there, and then divide it into 3 separate lots. Each lot would require its own separate sample request form, and that goes for any production area. Each production area, each harvest lot that you're sampling individually, you should be getting an individual sample request form for each of those lots. This harvest lot name says -2020, it's -2021. I need to fix that, but for these purposes, that's what that's for. I also wanted to mention that if a grower registered under a specific business name, that correct business name needs to be provided on their testing and sampling documents. This came up a lot last year, where we were getting the incorrect business name or a different name that you didn't register under. And so it takes a lot of time to try to track down who the test is actually for and what production area it corresponds to. So if you can just keep an eye out for that this year, and make sure that we're communicating with the growers that they need to use the correct business name. Also, I wanted to mention that the growers are required to submit a complete sample request form before the sampling occurs. So Sunny, if you can click on this slide, the second page of this should pop up. Yep, there it is. So please make sure that this section is complete. Make sure that they do provide a visual depiction of the harvest lot that's going to be sampled. And it's helpful if they outline areas that aren't sampled as well, but definitely make sure this form is complete before you do any sampling. I think we can move on to the next slide. To be sufficient to meet the requirement for pre-harvest sampling and testing, testing must be conducted as described in Exhibit A and Exhibit B protocols. These protocols are found in the Oregon Administrative Rules 603-048 that I mentioned earlier. I'll be going over some of the information in the sampling protocol, but definitely not all of it. So please familiarize yourself with both exhibits. I've included links to both directly here. They pertain to sampling and testing, so you should familiarize yourselves with those. And then if you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Next slide, please. So a couple key points about on-site sampling. Only samples taken by and remaining in the chain of custody of authorized labs qualify for testing. The sampling of a harvest lot must produce a representative sample of the entire lot. You must also avoid contamination of a sample and also disinfect all of your sampling tools when you finish your sample collection. So that's really important to keep in mind. If the grower is growing for flower only, you can only sample plants with flowers present. So if you go on site and there are no flowers on the plants, you'll need to reschedule if that grower is growing for flower. And then lastly, this is a pre-harvest test. So sampling of harvested hemp is absolutely, it's not allowed. And then, that includes like, you cannot take a sample that someone gives you. The only samples that qualify for a pre-harvest test are the samples that you take of the live plants out in the field or greenhouse. Okay, next slide, please. So I've included the equipment and supply list for sampling here on the left. Please ensure that you have all the necessary equipment before you arrive on site. So the first step when you arrive on site is to meet with a site representative and review the sample request form. So that's the form that the grower sends you You should review that with the site representative. And then once you go over that form, you would then survey the site that you're going to be sampling and then choose the best sampling pattern for that harvest lot. And I'll go over the sampling patterns in the next slide. But after you do that, you would then complete your on-site sampling form, which is a form similar to the sample request form that I'll go over as well. But basically you would complete that, gather the materials you need, and get ready to do your sampling. Next slide, please. These are 2 approved sampling patterns. Sampling must be done in a sawtooth pattern. As you can see on the left image, the sampler is starting their sampling in the upper left-hand corner of the field. And then these yellow dots represent where they took their samples. So they went and took 10 samples, and then another 10 samples, and then another 10 in a sawtooth pattern. And then you can see on the right here, the sampler started in the bottom left-hand corner of the field and then took their samples accordingly in that sawtooth pattern. So if there are certain field conditions that prevent you from sampling in a sawtooth pattern, it's okay to deviate slightly from that sawtooth pattern as long as the sample you collect is still a representative sample of the whole lot, and as long as the lot is still contiguous. So if you deviate slightly, that's okay. I think we can move on to the next slide. Here is what the on-site sample form looks like. This is available on our website. This form must be completed by the sampler. It cannot be completed by the person requesting sampling or the site representative. It needs to be completed by the sampler. Some of the information is similar on both the sample request form that the grower provides and then your form, and that's fine. But if there are any distinctions, please include those distinctions on your form. Some things that it's helpful to include when filling out this form are the number of samples that you take, any obstacles or barriers that prevent you from the ability to sample in that sawtooth pattern that we talked about, and any harvest lots that remain unsampled. And most of the time people will put that into the written description. And Sunny, if you want to click on that slide, there should be a second page. Yeah, and then so this is the second page to the on-site sample form. Please make sure that you complete this form, and then also in the visual depiction, we're asking you to map or sketch the harvest lot that you're going to be sampling. And also we're asking that you include the sample pattern. So if you're sampling like a field, we'll want to see the field and then that sawtooth pattern that you did to see how you collected the samples. So that's important. It gets left out a lot. So I wanted to mention it to please be sure to include that. I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're on to sample collection. So when you're collecting a sample, cut about 8 inches of the flowering tops. You should avoid sampling dead or diseased plants or plants that look mechanically injured. You would take 1 sample per plant and then you would place that sample into a paper bag. And since this is measuring a whole entire harvest lot and you're trying to get a representative sample, each flower or each top that you collect is going into 1 single bag. So keep that in mind. It's all in 1 bag, it's not separate bags. And we can move on to the next slide. And if you can click on that slide, there should be a graph that comes up, or table. So each bag or each composite sample should consist of a maximum of 30 plant heads about 8 inches long. For small fields or greenhouses, or when you know the amount of plants that you're sampling, you should use this table to the right. So that goes over the total number of plants and then how many samples you would be taking for that. So keep that in mind. Lastly, the sample size cannot be less than 4 ounces, which is the minimum amount necessary for laboratory tests. This is important, especially when we're needing to do like retesting of that file sample. So keep that in mind too, if you're doing a really small sample, that it needs to at least be 4 ounces. Next slide, please. Okay, so it comes up every year. So I just want to talk about it a little bit. Do not sample non-contiguous areas. So what I mean by a non-contiguous area is, one greenhouse is a contiguous area. 10 greenhouses is not one contiguous area. And it would be 10 separate contiguous areas that would need to be sampled separately and tested separately. So if you get to a site and there's 10 greenhouses, there's going to need to be 10 test reports for that. And hoop houses are the same. So if you get to a site with 10 hoop houses, we're going to need 10 test reports and 10 different samplings. I understand that sometimes these get a little bit complicated, especially with the hoop houses. So if you're on site and you're not sure, or if you're preparing to go on site and you're not sure, please reach out to me beforehand or while you're on site, and we can kind of go through it to just determine, if an area is contiguous or not. Some more examples of areas that aren't contiguous are if you have a field with like a county road going in between it. That happens a lot, where sometimes a grower will own, both sections on both sides of the road, and they'll try to combine both fields as one field. They're two separate fields because that road's running through them. We do allow an exception for a standard driveway, but like actual roads are not permitted. So, and then if there's a fence in between two areas, that's also non-contiguous if there's no gate. Irrigation ditches, waterways, tree lines, anything that's making one area into multiple areas would make an area non-contiguous. And I know this gets complicated. So like I said, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them. I also wanted to say that the areas sampled should be consistent with the areas provided on the grower registration. Our registration staff verify that each registered area is contiguous before approving the grow site application. So if you get to the grow site and what you see is non-contiguous, chances are it wasn't registered that way and they're trying to combine their areas for testing, which we'll get to later about how to actually do that beforehand. But if they're combining their areas for testing, that's not okay. So we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so after you've sampled a harvest lot or a production area, and you've got all of your plant heads and you place them into a single paper bag, you would then seal that bag and record on it the field name that you sampled, the harvest lot identifier or the production area name, the date that you sampled, your signature as a sampler, and then the grower or the business name. And that business name needs to be the business name that they registered under. And if they didn't register under a business name, it should be under the name that they registered under. So you're responsible for maintaining the custody and sample integrity of that sample during transport to the testing laboratory. So please keep that in mind. And we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so there are two ways to report your pre-harvest test results to the ODA. You can either do that by email or online. Some of the labs already have the link to submit your results online. However, if you don't have that link, please email me and I will send it to you. If you're submitting online, you do not have to make a ODA hemp THC report, which we'll get to in a couple slides, but you don't have to fill that out because the system automatically generates that report. You'll go through and enter the same information that you would put on that report, and then you would attach your sample request form and the on-site sampling form. Once you've done that and you hit enter, a PDF of the test report gets generated, and I'm asking that you go ahead and save that test report, and then you have to send that to the grower along with the sample request form and the on-site sample form. So once you submit the results, one of the benefits to using the online system is that it automatically filters into our database. So one, we're notified of pre-harvest fails quicker, which is important because usually there's time deadlines for retesting. So it's important for us to get notified of those quickly. And then two, it just allows us to have more accurate data faster, because if you submit online, we take those reports and then we have to hand enter them into our database. So it just takes a little bit more time on our end, but I understand that some labs, their systems just don't allow for doing online submittal, and so it's totally fine to stick with the online way of submitting. So we can click on the next slide. And this is how you would report your results via email if you wanted to do that. So you would fill out an ODA hemp THC report, and then you would send that THC report with the on-site sampling form and the sample request form to this email, hemptestreports@oda.state.or.us. And then you would send the grower who requested the testing all of that information, the THC report and the sampling forms. So we can move on to the next slide. Here's what the pre-harvest THC report looks like. If you're submitting by email, you'll need to fill this out. It's pretty self-explanatory. You just go through, you're the primary lab testing. If it's the first test, second test, grower name, harvest lot name, and then the results. If you're filling this out, please make sure, especially that the results are legible. That comes up. And I think with that, we can move on to the next slide. Okay, I wanted to talk about some of the common issues that have come up last year with pre-harvest testing. First is not reporting growers' test results or all of the required documentation like the sampling forms. I wouldn't say that this is particularly common, but last year it did happen, so I wanted to mention it. In some cases, the labs might even be held liable if you sampled for someone and they don't have a test report submitted. So please keep that in mind. Also, some things that we ran into are, like I said, combining production areas for testing. So getting test reports for multiple greenhouses, multiple hoop houses, 3 different fields. We're really going to need to make sure that you're not, the production areas that someone registers stay that way. So basically, if a grower wanted to, let's say that they had 2 fields, and if they were to combine them, it would still be one contiguous field, and for some reason they registered it as 2 in the beginning, and now that they're looking at it, they really want to just make it into 1. They can absolutely do that. They would just need to submit a change form to our department prior to it being classified as 1 for testing. So if you have a grower that's in that situation, tell them to reach out to our registration folks, and they'll help them actually combine those areas on their registration, and then you could sample it as 1. if it were approved and if it was actually contiguous. Another thing that's come up is when we're combining two registrants fields that are adjacent. So if we have one registrant, two registrants and they're both neighbors and their fields kind of back up to each other, it's not okay to sample both of those registrants' field as one field. One, that's combining production areas, and that's not allowed. And two, you're only getting one test report for two registrants, so it definitely causes some issues. Another issue is incorrectly advising growers on current rules and regulations. For obvious reasons, that creates issues. I would just say that if someone has questions about the rules, about our Oregon hemp rules, just refer them to our department and we can kind of walk them through that and kind of get them the information they need. I don't want any issues with labs being held liable over that type of information. So, and then lastly is illegible or incomplete paperwork. Happens a lot. I know that when you're out in the field, it's kind of difficult sometimes to write super legibly or take a lot of time on the forms, but I'm just asking for readable paperwork. It doesn't have to be pretty, but we do get forms a lot of the time where you can't really read them that well. So keep that in mind. It happens. So I think that with that, we can move on to the next slide. So moving on to pre-harvest test fails. Failed tests must be reported to the department within 24 hours. Growers do have some options if they fail a pre-harvest test. So they can have that file sample that the lab retained, they can have that retested. They can have the failed harvest lot or production area that was sampled, they can have it resampled again. If neither option is chosen, or if that resampling or retesting fails, then ultimately that harvest lot would need to get destroyed. I do want to say that we work through the retesting options and the destructions with the growers themselves. So please send them our way rather than advising them on what to do with the failed crop, because they do have options, and also the destruction does need to get approved by our department. So keep that in mind when you're dealing with some failed tests. And now we can move on to the next slide. This is a form that's on our website that is pretty handy and explains like all of the different deadlines and what to do if your pre-harvest test fails for THC. So I just want to run through it really quickly with you. If we start at the top, you'll see that if you want to retest the failed sample, you have to request that within 7 days to the lab that took that sample initially, and you'll need them to retest the file sample. If that passes, they need to get a second accredited lab to verify that result. So and they also need to do that within 7 days. So if you're working with that sort of situation, you'll need to work with the secondary lab in terms of transporting that file sample to maintain a chain of custody. If the grower wanted to resample the failed lot, they also have 7 days to request that after they were notified of the failed result. Then another requirement is they have to divide the production area into multiple harvest lots. So if you're coming out for a resample based off of a failed test, it'll need to be broken up into additional lots than what it originally was. And then obviously at the end, there's the destruction option, which is never a great option. And I think we can move on to the last slide. Which is the last slide. So thank you for joining me today. That concludes the 2021 laboratory sampler training video. My contact information is on this slide as well. So I try to make myself as available as possible for our labs. So if you have any questions, if you're out in the field, if you have questions about preparing to go out in the field, please feel free to contact me. I also included some helpful links to our information. So with that, I think we can open it up for questions if there are any questions.
Okay, this is Sunny, disembodied voice. Craig, I think I unmuted you if you want to go ahead and ask your question. I'm not hearing it. It might be easier if you type it in the question box. I unmuted you, Beth. Will it let you talk?
Okay, can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
We can't.
You can, okay. I believe growers are allowed to harvest as soon as sampling is complete. Is that correct? Without waiting for the results of the sample?
Yeah, I think technically that's fine. It might be a good idea to wait until you receive your test results back from the lab, because if in the event you fail a pre-harvest test, if you harvested already, you wouldn't qualify to resample that failed lot. So, if that's something you're worried about, I would always wait for those results. Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, I just wanted a clarification on that second part in case growers are in a hurry to harvest, but they haven't gotten the results.
Yeah, that's fine. And also you'll want to make sure that before you transport that material, you know what that was tested at, and make sure that it passed before you transport that.
We have a question in the box. Do we send results in only for failed tests?
No, so all pre-harvest tests are required to be submitted, regardless if they're passing or failing. For post-harvest tests, we only require failed post-harvest to be reported.
Eric, you're unmuted. Eric went.
Thank you. Quick question. The slide at the beginning said that there was 2021 pre-harvest tests from last year, or was that this year already?
No, it was from 2020. So there was 2021 test reports submitted for 2020.
Last year. Got it. Okay, thank you. And there was another slide regarding the registered fields and like contiguous versus non-contiguous fields. Is that, there's no way for us to verify that info ahead of time, is there?
So if you wanted to verify, if you had questions about whether a certain area was considered contiguous, you could always email me like the map that they provided you, and I could take a look at it. And I could also look at their application to see if that's how they registered those areas. You could also ask to see a copy of their registration application to see how they designated those fields prior, to make sure that they weren't combining those areas for testing.
Okay, that's helpful. So whether they have it or not, but we could ask for a copy of their registration to show the fields that how they originally attempted to lay it out if we're having questions about whether it's contiguous or not.
Yeah, I would say that's.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Craig, sorry about the audio issues. Craig's question was, could you create a sheet to simplify hoop house continuity rules? So it sounds like kind of similar to Eric's question. We can certainly take that into consideration about how to articulate that on a handout.
Yeah, and if you're, I understand that a lot of it's with hoop houses in particular, they can get kind of complicated because it seems like everybody's doing something different. And so, you know, you could always refer the grower to myself personally or to anyone in our program, and we can help walk them through their areas and kind of what would need to get tested separately, and then, you know, what potentially, like I said, if they wanted to change it using the change form, what they could combine for testing. So feel free to refer people to us, and we can help them walk through it.
Okay, Robert has a question. How much weight did you say a lab needs for potency testing? 4 ounces?
So for a pre-harvest test, the minimum sample that you need to collect is 4 ounces.
Okay. And then Alex Whitaker says, just wanted to make sure that none of the sample requirements have changed from last year. The required increments, lot sizes, minimum sample volume all seem to be the same from last year.
Yeah, there were no significant changes to the sampling protocols. The one thing that comes to mind, though, we did add a requirement that all laboratory staff watch this training before they go out and sample. So that was a change from last year to this year. But in terms of all the other things that you mentioned, yeah, no, nothing has changed.
Okay, another question from Robert. Could you explain the drying and sieve requirements?
Yeah, so that's in our Exhibit B testing protocol. So once the sampler takes the sample back to the lab would then have to dry that sample and sieve it. And then at that point, that's when you would run your analytical test on it. I'm not sure do you have any questions about those requirements in particular? And maybe Sunny can jump in, but I do know that that is a requirement, and some labs have asked us, you know, specifically about the sieving, if that's what your question is.
Yeah, the size of the sieve. I think Robert, you need to refer to that exhibit, and if you still have questions, give Emily a call. Okay, any other questions today? I would just jump in real quick, kind of going back to Alex's question about things changing. Things will change in 2022. The department will be using this year to go through a rulemaking process to become a USDA 2018 Farm Bill compliant state. And so the URL that Emily has here, this oda.fyi-subscribe, if you are not on that and you want to stay up to date on how that rulemaking process goes and what those changes might be, that would be the best place to stay up to date, is to sign up for that, and we will send emails out as we work through that process. So just know that this training is good for 2021, and we will be doing a new training next year to give you updates on those changes.
Yeah, and if there's no more questions, I just wanted to say, if you, if the staff or the laboratory personnel who want to send, if they could send me an email saying who watched the training, that would be helpful, so I can verify the samplers and the lab staff that have watched this training today as well.
And we're working out a process for you to verify that with the department to meet that new change that Emily mentioned of everybody having to attend the training. So I would expect that you'll get additional emails from Emily about that, asking for that verification. And I anticipate having this video up by next week. So as you get new staff on for the harvest season, it'll be available on ODA's website through our YouTube channel for those staff to watch the training and make sure that they're meeting that requirement. Last call for questions. Okay. Great job, Emily. And we thank everybody for their time today.
Yeah, thank you.